So hello everybody, I'm Deborah Evans, Chief Executive of LLG, and I'm joined this week by Dennis Hall, our Bulletin Editor.
Hello everyone.
And welcome to the brand new discussion format on the vlog. Now, each week we're going to take a topic of interest and then have a close look at it in the discussion. Over the coming weeks, we also plan to be joined by others with a special interest in the subject under consideration. But first, Dennis, what are we going to look at today?
Well, Deborah, with LLG's governance conference taking place in Sheffield on the 10th of November, it seems timely for us to take a look at the main theme of the conference, those formal steps that trigger government intervention into the affairs of councils, namely public interest reports and those Section 114 notices. And I see that there's a session on public interest reports and the Golden Triangle, with top speakers from our sector attending. And as the programme says, the catastrophic financial failure of a local authority is no longer that rare event that it once was. So what I'd suggest I do, if I may, Deborah, is perhaps look at some aspects of these provisions, summarise them before we get into our discussion. Right, so let's look at public interest reports. These are issued by external auditors under Section 24 of the Local Audit and Accountability Act 2014. And the Act places a duty on a local auditor to consider whether, in the public interest, they should make a public interest report on any matter that comes to their attention during the audit of a local authority's accounts. Next, Section 114. Well, this is contained in the Local Government Act 1972, of course. And these notices are issued by the Council's Section 151 officer. And they freeze all spending except for that required by the law. And Section 114, subsection 3 says further, the Chief Finance Officer shall make a report under this section if it appears that expenditure is likely to exceed the resources available to meet that expenditure. Deborah.
Well, I mean, there's some key groundworks there. That's why it's done. But tell me, I mean, 114 notices are all over the news at the moment. So how are the powers being used and what are the problems that people are actually looking to address with the use of these powers?
Well, Deborah, that really is the central question in all of this. And we've got to look at the context first before we look at anything else on these provisions. And I think the first thing to note is that the use of these public interest reports and Section 114 notices is currently unprecedented and across the political spectrum entirely. Many commentators consider that this is due to a fundamental instability in the system of local government. But government does not share that view. Michael Gove says that local authorities are responsible for their own financial decisions. And in the case of Birmingham, for example, he says that local issues concerning equal pay and the rollout of a major IT system were both the main causes of their problems. Now, the kind of issues that have given rise to the use of these powers, however, are wide-ranging. They include poor investment decisions, issues with council-run companies, equal pay, not just in Birmingham, and project management issues. And there are many more circumstances that have given rise to the exercise of these powers. But let me say this, specifically in relation to the question that you ask. I think these powers are being used as a signal, like someone pulling the emergency cord on a runaway train. Everyone knows it's going too fast, and someone needs to bring the train to a halt. And what seems to be happening is that this signal becomes the evidential basis for government intervention and the appointment of commissioners. Deborah.
Well, that's really interesting because it does bring the train to a complete halt. And it is an absolute emergency stop, slam the brakes on. And part of me wonders whether maybe just getting it to slow down a little before it hits the buffers might be a better option. So that there do seem to be wide-ranging problems underpinning the use of the 114 reports. And indeed, equal pay is something we're also hoping to touch on at the governance conference because of the huge financial price tag that comes with that, which is really causing some of this financial instability. But it's not just the problems behind the powers being used. There's also issues around the use of the powers as well. So tell me what problems people are having in actually trying to issue Section 114 notices.
Well, I mean, I think there are a couple of issues on this. All local authorities, have highly sophisticated financial reporting mechanisms. And this touches on the point that you've just mentioned. Local authorities can see what's coming down the track. If the train is travelling too fast, they should know about it well before the emergency cord is pulled. Now, I suspect, and this is just my opinion on this, I suspect that the drastic nature of the powers is such that it must give rise to considerable hesitation at member and officer level. Just think, if you will, of the scale of the corporate and governance and reputational risks that come into play in situations where councils find themselves now. And indeed, there might well be professional reluctance amongst the officers too to engage these powers. And I'd be interested to hear what views others have on this particular element that I've raised. And remember too that in many of these interventions, large-scale losses and liabilities have been accrued over many, many months before formal action is actually taken. So I think the timing of reporting is an issue. I think the powers do not help either. I see little that suggests in an emerging financial crisis that there is an imperative to act to stem losses as they appear. So yes, if I ask the question, should the councils be acting sooner? Yes, I think that must be right. But again, I'd be interested to hear what the panelists and the delegates have to say at the conference on that.
Well, I'm pretty sure one of the things that Grant Thornton will say, for example, is that these things don't happen overnight. And you've just said it can be many months. But actually, I think there's an argument in some cases, particularly where it's poor governance that leads to these situations, that actually it can be many years. And year after year, it's slipping further and further towards a situation that's almost not possible to recover from. Whereas in other cases, for example, the recent hikes in interest rates may mean decisions on borrowing that looked low risk a few
Yes.
years ago are now high risk. And sometimes it's about projecting that risk in a number of different scenarios as to what happens if this happens, rather than just working on where you are today. And I think things like the decline in the high street and some of the commercial property returns has
Yes.
also been something that's caused issues. So I think there's a lot to be done with better management of risk within local authorities as well. So you've talked about trying to flag things earlier. I know risk management could be improved, but do you think there's anything else that could be done to improve the reporting process?
Well, I'm going to be controversial in what I'm about to say. I don't think that the existing powers on financial reporting were designed ever to anticipate the scale and scope of corporate financial failures that we're seeing at this time. I think a new approach is needed. And for me, a new approach would involve earlier intervention to deal with the causes of the financial problems, involving earlier referral to the government, to DeLuc, to plan a way out of the situation before it gets worse. It seems to me the government department, ministerial department should be involved in working with local authorities much earlier. And then there's our favourite friend, the Golden Triangle. I think we need to look at the roles of the senior officers in the Golden Triangle. And you might be surprised to hear me say this, but I'm going to say it. I think there's been too much focus just on the shoulders of the monitoring officer in this. We've heard many times in many reports that governance is a shared responsibility. It is a corporate responsibility. And I think the role of the Golden Triangle officers is key, but it needs to be re-examined. We often polarize, as I say, upon the role of the monitoring officer, but of the three officers, interestingly, the chief executive has the ultimate officer superiority. But unlike the other two who have statutory powers, the chief executive has no statutory powers and certainly nothing that enables him or her to act in these situations, although he or she must have significant influence on the other two. And I find this to be an odd imbalance, frankly. And again, I'd be interested to hear what the panel and delegates have to say about this. Should the chief executive have powers, perhaps to suspend activities where significant losses are emerging? Should he or she have a role in terms of making a referral to Duluth at a certain point where a crisis has occurred? So the general question I raise in answer to this is, should the reporting powers of the statutory officers be recast in light of what we know now from the circumstances that are arising with local authorities in severe financial crisis? Deborah.
Well, I think the answer to that basic question of is there a case for change or reform is obviously yes.
Yeah.
The question is what? And that's something that we've talked about in the podcast as well, as to whether a new legislative framework would be sensible that actually lays down more powers for the monitoring officer, the chief exec, etc., and reflects modern governance. I mean, you talked about the golden triangle. These are concepts that have come in way since that original legislation was drafted. So the basic answer is yes, absolutely, there's a case for change or reform. In the interim, we're obviously looking at building best practice guidance. We're also working on, as we speak, a draft code for statutory officers. Where people don't have power, they still have responsibility, and that's the key thing. And equally, we know the monitoring officer in many of these situations where Section 114 notices are being issued, they have a really, really tough time. And actually, it would be great to have some powers that actually back them in the steps that they
I
take.
agree.
I mean, we have some very, very brave people out there who are willing to stand up when they see that there are problems that need to be solved and literally put their neck on the line. And it would be fantastic to have some of these things then enshrined in legislation. And you'll know that we've been fighting for statutory protection for monitoring officers and that the government's given promises on that, but as yet we've not seen that. So absolutely a case for change or reform. If you'd like to be part of that debate, do come and join us in Sheffield on November the 10th and then online 1 week later on November the 17th. This is important for everybody, regardless of what stage you're at in your legal career. So please do come and join us. And until next week, it's goodbye from me.
And from me too.
Thank you very much.